File DCF fund balance. Mr. Guidry.
I'll have the proposed changes up in a minute on the full screen. And within policy file DCF, we have some proposed changes. They're all contained at the very end of the policy. This is a follow-up to a previous Finance Committee meeting that we had where there was some discussions on possible changes to this particular policy. And the changes that we've reflected in the attachment to this agenda item basically keeps the 3 months of economic stabilization funds intact, but provides for any surplus once that 3 months is met, that any surplus let's say in fiscal year 17 is what we're talking about, in excess of 100,000 would be transferred to a self-funded construction fund and capital improvements fund, with the board determining the amounts that are to be allocated between those funds and between two accounts within those funds. One is committed school site renovations construction. We used to use the word reserve. That word's been changed to committed. This would be the projects, for the most part, that were listed in the tax initiative. Funding would be set aside within that account. And the other account is committed for a fiscal year, whatever the fiscal year is, projects. So, for example, we're in fiscal year 18 right now. We typically put funding aside for fiscal year 19 to ensure that we have capital funds available for projects within that school year. So that's basically a summary of the proposed changes to the policy file DCF regarding fund balance. With regards to that, if we apply that to the results of operations for fiscal year 17, we start with a projected surplus of about $12.4 million. Of that $12.4 million, about $8 million was due to revenues. It was not a surprise. We typically budget revenues conservatively. We had budgeted flat, where in the areas of sales tax specifically and property taxes, of course, actual collections were much higher. And then we also had an increase in our MFP revenues, some of them one-time, slight increase in our interest income to account for the $8 million in revenues. The $4 million in expenditures are basically in salaries and benefits, and the reason for that mainly relates to when you have, we're looking at staffing in February of 2017 when we're budgeting for the current year. We have a lot of retirements at year end, and typically when those individuals get replaced, they typically get replaced with someone on the with fewer years of experience. And so you have that running through all of the different object codes, teachers, same thing for principals, assistant principals, so on and so forth. Basically all school personnel, whenever they're being replaced and it's with someone with fewer years of experience, it's going to result in the budget being less than actual expenses. So with that said, we have some proposed transfers out. Keep in mind that when we transfer out for the current fiscal year that we're looking at is fiscal year 17. So when we make these transfers within 17, we're transferring the surplus, so it doesn't create a deficit. If we wait till another year, to a subsequent year, to make a transfer, those transfers, if they're in excess of the surplus, could actually result in a deficit. So from an accounting perspective, this is a good time for us to look at it, because to consider it later on would have, in terms of reporting, could result in a deficit. And when we're looking at $12 million, I would say it's safe to say it would result in a deficit, because we typically don't have this size of a surplus. Anyway, the proposed transfers, we have one to the OPEB trust, $750,000. That's just keeping in line, showing an effort to make contributions to that trust. In meeting with our actuary, there will be a greater focus on funding for this particular trust across the state and in other states as well. They're starting to see the momentum pick up as more attention is being given to it. So the board has consistently, whenever they can, put money into the trust to show an effort. It's not at the level that it needs to be at, but it's at least a start. Here's the transfer to self-funded construction, $838,000. Typically, we try to transfer about the same amount to self-funded as we do to the next capital fund, which is the capital improvement funds. You notice that there's a difference of about $1.9 million, and the reason for that is we're proposing including in that transfer of $2,738,000 in 18-19, $1 million for science adoption textbooks and $900,000 for robotics middle and elementary schools to implement a robotic program at those levels as well. And then that would leave $8,002,582 to transfer to the school site renovation construction account, resulting in the $100,000 that the fund balance policy provides for. We would like to show a minimal surplus from an operational standpoint. So with these transfers made, just for a minute, assuming that, that they'll be approved this evening, if they are in fact approved, this is what self-funded construction would look like. We currently have $2.6 million set aside for 18-19. We have excess collections that go directly to self-funded construction of $1.8 million, plus this $838,000 transfer that's listed up here, that would be funded by the surplus of 17, would total to about $5.3 million. Now, this particular fund, historically, if you take a look at it, has been anywhere from the $4 or $5 million range, as much as $8 million. So this would basically get us sort of, right in the middle of that range. And when you consider what our sales tax collections have been doing for the last couple of years, I think that would be a very good place to be. And considering the fact that the number of projects that we're doing, actually completing, has increased as well. So that's a very positive statement with regards to the board's actions. With regards to the committed for school sites renovations and construction, we currently have $250,000 in the budget. Here's the $8,002,000 transfer that I spoke about earlier. If that transfer is made out of the general fund surplus from fiscal year 17, it would make available $8.25 million for the projects listed in the tax initiative. The capital improvements funds, we already have currently committed for 18-19, $2.76 million. Here's the excess sales tax collections of $1.8 million. They're typically the same as self-funded construction because we take the excess divided by 2 and send it directly from the sales tax fund to the capital funds. And that's that provision the board made several years ago. 75% of the excess of sales tax collections, actual sales tax collections, over budgeted, gets allocated between self-funded and capital. So we make these transfers at the end of the fiscal year once we know what that excess is. And then the transfer from the general fund surplus of $2.7 million, that would bring us to $7.3 million in capital improvements funds. So this would basically be the game plan if the board later this evening were to approve this change in the fund balance policy. Keep in mind that the fund balance policy, or these transfers, can be made whether the policy is adopted in the proposed format or not. In other words, we have proposed final budget revisions for fiscal year 17 included on the board's agenda item later this evening, and they reflect these transfers. If the board doesn't approve them, then we will revise them to reflect what the board does approve, and that will become our final budgets for fiscal year 17. Any questions with regards to either the proposed changes in fund balance or any of these proposed transfers out of the general fund surplus from fiscal year 17 into our two capital funds?
I have a question. Maybe I should know the answer to, but what is the difference between self-funded construction and capital improvements fund that goes to committed projects?
Typically, it's the nature of the projects. They both have a $25,000 minimum threshold in order for a project to be classified as a capital project. And then self-funded construction is typically renovations, where physical renovations to physical plants, and capital is more equipment, AC, portable buildings, things of that, tractors, vehicles, buses, things of that nature. So it's more the difference in the type of capital projects that are being handled.
My question is along those same lines. One of those two funds that we're talking about, would one of them be replacement of portable buildings or purchase of portable buildings, or neither?
Well, portable buildings would normally come out of the capital improvements fund. If the board approves the purchase of portable buildings, that's typically where it would be funded.
But my question was getting rid of portable buildings and adding permanent buildings. Neither one of these two appropriations, it doesn't fit either of them?
The committed for 18-19 projects, that line item, that basically is the funding that becomes available for our 18-19 projects. So if one or some of those projects are removal of portable buildings, then the 5.3, I'm sorry, let's see, the 7.3 million here minus the 1.9, if the board were to put setting aside, would be available. Some of that would be available to address those types of projects.
Thank you.
Okay, Billy. So with the $8.2 million for the committed school sites, like what kind of bonding capacity do we get out of that, if any?
Well, at that level, it would be more pay-as-you-go, because ultimately, this is a one-time $8 million. If it were recurring, then it would have a much more significant impact, and I think it would lend itself to looking at being able to bond, sell some bonds. But at this level, you're looking more at pay-as-you-go.
Okay, and what can we get for $8.2 million from construction, a wing?
Depending on the projects that you look at, there are a few projects where that would just about address about 80%, depending on which school site, 80 to 100% of a total replacement of portable buildings at some of our elementary schools that were listed in the tax initiative.
So it would be a wing, building of a wing?
It would be either full replacement or partial replacement.
Well, what do you mean replacement? Getting rid of the old tent buildings and getting new ones?
With wings, with permanent construction, okay. Yes, yeah. Typically, if you look at it, it ranged from anywhere from, depending on the campus, as little as $4 million to roughly $12 million. But the typical campus is normally in about the $10 million range. So it's just a little shy of being able to completely replace portable with permanent constructions at one of the sites listed in the
and
tax
would that
initiative.
Include the upgrades to the cafeteria space or the
Yes.
office space and that as
it
well?
would.
Okay. So in the policy revision that's recommended, you're still recommending keeping 3 months in reserve, but the law only requires 2 months, right? We keep a month more than we're required to keep.
With regards to the 2 months is more of a recommendation as opposed to being statutorily required, but that is correct. It would be 1 month more than what is recognized nationally. And, one of the things we attributed that to, or one of the reasons why we feel we need to exceed that 2 months is most school districts outside of our state rely more on property taxes than sales taxes. That's not the case for us anyway, here in Lafayette Parish. So, and the reason for that is property tax is much more stable and easier to project and easier to bond out. So, given the fact that we rely more heavily on sales taxes, we feel that it requires a larger reserve. But that's just an opinion.
So currently, what is the value, for lack of a better term, of 1 month of reserve?
It's right at $22 million.
So half of that would be 11 million.
Right.
So the board could, if they so chose, to reduce the reserve to 2.5 months, for example, even if it was on a 1-year basis, and go back up to 3 years next year. But then that additional $11 million out of reserve could be added to that 8.25 million. And would that give us more buying power as far as bonding capacity, or is that the one-time money issue again?
We'd still be looking at pay-as-you-go. With that kind of construction, it would be, 1 or 2 projects if the board so chose, complete replacement. The only thing to keep in mind that differs a little from what's presented is that would, in fact, of course, reduce fund balance. So in order to accomplish that, we would be reporting a deficit for the fiscal year. With regards to bond ratings, I don't know if that would have an impact on it. I know we could explain it and show that it's a one-time transfer. So hopefully that would mitigate any or remove any impact. But that's just a information point.
I guess my concern is that the taxpayers clearly told us that we need to live within our means, and we have so many projects and we're so far behind that one wing at one school is great, but it's such a Band-Aid on the problem that we need to be a little more aggressive for a couple of years to get things moving along. So I understand the desire to be very conservative and keeping a 3-year reserve, but at the same time, and we can't fix our facilities on the backs of our teachers and our staff and our students. So we need to be able to live within our means in a reasonable and conservative way, but to do the best that we can do. So if we're able to do 2 wings at 2 of our critical schools and reduce that reserves for just 1 year to 2.5 months rather than 3, then I think that, at least we're putting 2 Band-Aids on the problem and not just 1. So that's kind of where I'm thinking, but I don't know what other board members are thinking.
Well, Mr. Gidger, that was the question I was going to ask you was it a gap recommendation for 2 months? I think the answer was yes on that.
Yes, the board has the option to adjust it to
so
2 months.
We had a big sales tax dip in I guess it would be
2016.
16?
Yeah, fiscal year 16.
Prior to that was probably 2009, 2008?
2009-10. Yeah, fiscal year 2010.
And pulling a number out, what would be that dip that we saw in those bad years?
In fiscal year 2010, it was about $1 million a month, so roughly $12 million. And in 2016, it was about $800,000 a month, so about 9.6 million, something like that.
So it'd be reasonable to change this policy to maybe 3 months is, I guess 50% conservative over the recommendation, considering the recommendation is 2 months. Reducing it to 2.5 still seems to me that it would leave an extra $11 million before you get to in round numbers.
Right.
Before you get to the 2-month reserve, even if we had a bad year. If we had to dip in to cover a typical loss
Yes.
that we've seen in the last decade. Okay. How would you personally feel if we changed the 3 months to 2.5? Well, part of the problem, if you do it for a year and then you change it back to 3 years, you then have to fund that extra Yeah. I don't mind leaving it at 2.5 forever, but anyway, how would you feel?
Well, 3 months would make me most comfortable. Personally, my personal opinion, just from the standpoint that I look at it, as you mentioned, and then I take it, one step further, which it's all in, personal opinion or personal approach, and I take a look at, heaven forbid, Hurricane Harvey. The impact it's going to have on the sales tax base in Houston is going to be pretty significant. So, and it's, how often does that occur? Well, thank goodness not very frequently, but when it does, if you have it, then that's one less thing you have to deal with. So that's sort of how, I view it. And, in looking at it and in supporting 3 months, one of the things that Mr. Cole and I discussed was if we were to leave it at 3 months, but make it 3 months of expenditures, not operating expenditures and transfers. Because when we make this, when we transfer out this $12 million, that goes into the calculation of the 3 months. So if we remove the transfers, because the way the financial reports are presented, you have your operating expenses, you subtotal them, you have your operating transfers out, which are basically transfers to other funds, and then the transfers out and your operating expenses are added together to come to the total, and that's the total that we're currently computing 3 months on. If we were to take 3 months, that calculation, and base it only on the operating expenses, you're looking at $3 million, reducing the Economic Stabilization Fund, keeping it at 3 months, but reducing the amount required by $3 million. Now, it's not the 11, but, that's just a consideration. If the board were interested in keeping it at 3 months, the calculation would be 3 months of operating expenses, not operating expenses and transfers out.
And Mr. Guidry, you mentioned Harvey. My concern is that if we have a Harvey or an Irma here, the state of our schools would not be able to survive that in their current condition. So it's like, what comes first, the chicken or the egg?
Yeah.
Okay. So, we have been tasked by the taxpayers with this recent tax proposition failure and finding the money within our system to fix the problems with our facilities. And so I understand your concern, and I would expect nothing less from you, Mr. Guidry, but we have to take something. We have to take some steps to move forward, and we can't do it one little wing at a time. That's, by the time you build one wing and get to the end of the project, that wing is old, and it's just a never-ending problem. So I think that this board needs to, at some point, just be a bit more aggressive, perhaps, to get some of these facility needs taken care of. So,
okay. Mr. Guidry, is that transfer language in this policy? The operating expenditures and transfers, or is it in another policy?
It's based on the, it's in the current policy, and it's just, basically, we would clarify within the policy where that total stops. In other words, right now, there's no specific mention of it, so that would mean you'd go to the total of the two. We would specifically mention operating expenses, which would stop it at the calculation would be based on that first subtotal.
Okay, Madam President, I recommend that we change the requirement for 3 months to 2.5 months in this policy, and also recommend that we additionally define what we're reserving to include the operating funds, but not those funds that we're transferring. Did I word that correctly?
Yes, operating expenses before operating transfers out. Okay.
So I'd ask that staff potentially rework this and bring it back to us.
okay. Now, is there any time-sensitive issues on this policy for this meeting, or can?
We can have that change in time for the board. board meeting this evening. In order for it to be included in fiscal year 17, we basically have through the end of this week to actually make the transfers. So it is a time-sensitive issue, and the numbers just became available like first week of September.
Well, I
So-
think this matter is also on the agenda for the regular meeting, so we can make our recommendation here, but it still has to go to the full board, so we don't know what will happen with the full board. So, Eric, do you want to, since we still have one more thing to discuss before our workshop, do you want to defer that to the regular meeting, your motion?
Sure,
So that we
whatever
don't have to
works.
do-
I mean, I can do
okay.
it then.
Sure, Mr. Santani.
Pardon me for coming in on the end of the discussion. I am familiar with the policy and the transfers. Can you, Eric, could you please just kind of clarify what it was that you want to accomplish? I got the 2.5 months, but
Well, Mr. Gidger is explaining that the calculation he uses to get to the total of what we're holding back is of the 20, say roughly 22 million a year, also includes, and he can explain it better than I can, money that he's transferring. And he was saying he could further reduce the requirement if he did not include money he's transferring, I guess, within the budget.
okay.
But he knows the answer better than I do.
Just wanted to know. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, we'll defer that to the regular meeting. The second thing on the executive committee agenda is the proposed policy for a fundraising matching program. That's also on the regular agenda tonight. And since I don't want us to go off schedule with the workshop, I just want to say that I will fully and vigorously oppose this particular proposed policy at the meeting, and I'm sure it'll be a robust debate. Mr. Knezik or Mr. Angel, you have anything you want to say at this point? You want to save it for later? Okay. All right, then I will adjourn this meeting so that we can start the workshop on time.